The West may think we couldn't find their listening base, but I did something that shocked America. For years, hidden in plain sight, disguised as a telecommunications facility, buried under layers of diplomatic agreements and classified partnerships in the heart of Ouagadougou. I found it, Trump. The CIA. Operating on our soil. Without our knowledge, our consent. Listening to everything. When my intelligence chief brought me the report, I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. I said, "You're telling me the Americans have been spying on us from inside our own capital?" He didn't laugh. He said, "Mr. President, for at least few years. Few years ago. While we held cabinet meetings, they listened. While we planned military operations, they recorded. While we negotiated with foreign partners, they knew our position before we spoke it. While we lived our lives, they watched." I looked at the evidence. Satellite images showing equipment that doesn't belong in a telecom facility. Manifests listing technology that has nothing to do with phone networks. Personnel records showing contractors rotating in and out on 3-month cycles. Diplomatic vehicles arriving at odd hours with no diplomatic purpose. And suddenly, everything made sense. The leaks that shouldn't have happened. The negotiations that went badly for no reason. The opposition that seemed to know our plans before we implemented them. The foreign governments that anticipated our moves before we made them. We weren't governing a sovereign nation. We were performing in a monitored theater. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my office, staring at the files, asking myself one question: what do I do with this? Because exposing it meant war, not military war, economic war, diplomatic war, media war, the kind of war that destroys presidencies and collapses economies. But hiding it meant surrender. It meant accepting that Burkina Faso exists at the pleasure of foreign intelligence agencies. It meant admitting that our sovereignty is fiction. It meant teaching my children that dignity has a price, and sometimes that price is too high to pay. I called my wife. It was 3 a.m. She answered immediately because presidents' wives learn to sleep lightly. I said, "I found something that will change everything." She said, "Tell me." I told her. Everything. The facility. The surveillance, the years of violation, the choice I faced. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What does your heart tell you?" I said, "My heart tells me to fight, but my head tells me to calculate the cost." She said, "Your head will always find reasons to compromise. Your heart knows what's right. Listen to it." I said, "They'll destroy us economically. They'll isolate us diplomatically. They'll attack us in every international forum." She said, "Then we'll be destroyed with dignity instead of prospering with shame. Our children will inherit poverty with pride instead of wealth with humiliation." That conversation decided everything. Not the evidence, not the strategic calculations, not the political considerations, but a wife reminding her husband that some things matter more than comfort. I ordered the raid at dawn. No warning, no negotiation, no diplomatic courtesy. My security forces surrounded the facility at 5:30 a.m. The Americans inside panicked. They started destroying equipment, smashing hard drives, burning documents, erasing servers, frantically eliminating evidence. My commander called me. "Mr. President, they're destroying everything. Should we stop them?" I said, "Let them destroy what they can. We'll recover what remains. Their panic is evidence enough." We secured the facility by 7. By 8, my technical team was inside, recovering data from damaged equipment. By 9, we had enough evidence to prove what I already knew. But evidence wasn't the point. The point was the message. The point was showing Burkina Faso and showing Africa and showing the world that we found them, that we confronted them, that we refused to pretend we didn't know. I called the American ambassador. He arrived at noon, rehearsing his denials, preparing his diplomatic language, ready to explain and justify and minimize. I didn't let him speak. I slid a folder across the table. Inside are photographs of your facility, manifests of your equipment, records of your personnel, intercepts of your communications. I know everything. Don't insult me with lies. His face changed. The diplomatic mask cracked. He said, "Mr. President, this facility exists for regional security, to combat terrorism, to protect both our interests." I said, "Protect from whom? The only threat to Burkina Faso's security is sitting in my office right now." He tried a different approach. We have agreements, protocols. Previous administrations gave consent. I said, previous administrations sold what wasn't theirs to sell. My predecessor doesn't own Burkina Faso's sovereignty. I don't own it. The people own it. And the people didn't consent to being surveilled by foreign intelligence. He leaned forward, dropping the diplomatic pretense. Mr. President, if you go public with this, there will be consequences. Serious consequences. For your economy, for your international relationships, for your political future. And there it was. The threat wrapped in concern, the punishment disguised as warning, the violence hidden behind diplomatic language. I stood up. You have 72 hours. Remove your personnel, remove your equipment, remove every trace of your operation. Or I remove it for you, and I do it on live television. He said, you're making a mistake. I said, the mistake was made few years ago when you thought you could violate our sovereignty without consequences. I'm correcting it. He left without shaking my hand. Good. I don't shake hands with people who spy on me. That afternoon I called my cabinet. My ministers filed in nervous, sensing something significant was coming. I told them everything. The facility, the surveillance, the confrontation, the ultimatum, silence. The kind of silence that happens when people realize their entire reality just shifted. My finance minister spoke first. Mr. President, if you expose this publicly, the Americans will retaliate economically. We'll lose aid. We'll lose loans. We'll lose investment. I said, then we lose them. But we gain something more valuable. We gain the knowledge that we're not for sale. My foreign minister said, the international community will isolate us. We'll be excluded from forums. We'll lose diplomatic standing. We'll be treated as pariahs. I said, good. Then we'll know who our real friends are. Then we'll discover which nations respect sovereignty and which nations demand submission. My defense minister said, Mr. President, I support this decision, but I must warn you, there may be attempts to destabilize the government, coup plots, assassination attempts. They won't let this go unanswered. I said, I know, increase security, monitor potential threats, but don't let fear of consequences prevent us from doing what's right. Then my education minister spoke. She's young, educated in France, usually cautious about confronting the West. She said, Mr. President, I spent few years in Paris. I have a French degree. I speak their language. I understand their culture. And I'm telling you, expose them. Because I'm tired of being educated to serve their interests. I'm tired of learning their values while forgetting ours. I'm tired of being taught that Africa needs saving by people who are busy exploiting it. She started crying, not sad crying, angry crying, liberating crying. I have a daughter, she said. She's 7, and every day she comes home from school asking why Africa is poor, why Africa needs help, why Africa is always the victim. And I don't know what to tell her, because the answer is sitting in that facility. The answer is in the resources they extract, the intelligence they steal, the sovereignty they violate. Expose them. Not for us. For her. So she grows up knowing her mother worked for a president who chose dignity. That moment changed everything. Because it wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about economics or diplomacy or international relations. It was about a mother wanting her daughter to inherit pride. I addressed the nation that evening. Live, unscripted, unfiltered. I stood in front of the cameras and told our people everything. The facility, the surveillance, the violation, the confrontation, the ultimatum, the choice. I said, for 8 years, foreign intelligence operated on our soil without our knowledge. They listened to our government. They monitored our military. They tracked our citizens. They violated our sovereignty. And nobody stopped them because nobody knew. I said, but now we know. And knowing changes everything. Because we can't unknow it. We can't pretend it didn't happen. We can't accept it and move forward. We must confront it. I said they'll call this reckless. They'll say I'm damaging our international relationships. They'll warn of economic consequences. They'll predict isolation and poverty and collapse. I said, maybe they're right. Maybe we will suffer economically. Maybe we will face isolation. Maybe we will struggle. I said, but we will struggle as free people. We will suffer with dignity. We will face consequences as a sovereign nation, and that's worth more than all their aid combined. The crowd didn't just applaud. They roared. They chanted. They sang. They wept. Because finally, someone said what they felt but never heard from leadership. Finally, someone chose them over foreign approval. Finally, someone valued their dignity over diplomatic convenience. Within hours, the video exploded online. 10 million views in the first day, 50 million in a week, 200 million in a month, translated into 40 languages, shared across every platform, discussed in every capital. But more importantly, something else happened, something they didn't expect, something I didn't fully anticipate. Letters started arriving. Thousands of them, from across Africa, from ordinary people who had been waiting for someone to say it. One letter came from a farmer in Tanzania, handwritten, barely legible, but powerful. Mr. President, I am 63 years old. I grow maize. I never went to school. I don't understand politics. But I understand this. When someone enters your home without permission, they are not a guest. They are a thief. The Americans entered Africa's home. You threw them out. Thank you for defending our home. Another letter from a university student in Kenya. I study computer science in Nairobi. My professors are brilliant, but they teach us to build technology for Western companies, to solve Western problems, to serve Western interests. Your speech made me realize we can build technology for African problems, for African solutions, for African interests. You gave me permission to be African and excellent simultaneously. A letter from a grandmother in Senegal. I am 80 years old. I survived colonization. I watched independence. I saw our leaders promise freedom and deliver dependence. I thought I would die before seeing true sovereignty. Your speech gave me hope that my grandchildren will live in a truly free Africa. Thank you for letting me die with hope. A letter from a soldier in Mali. I fight terrorists every day. The Americans give us equipment. They give us training. They give us intelligence. But they never give us respect. They treat us like children who need supervision. Like we can't secure our own countries without their guidance. Your speech reminded me that we can, that we must, that our sovereignty depends on it. These letters broke me. Not because they were sad, because they were real. Because they showed that millions of Africans were waiting for leadership that valued them over foreign approval. Waiting for someone to choose dignity over dependency. Waiting for someone to say no and mean it. I read every letter, all 7,000 in the first month. My staff thought I was crazy. They said, Mr. President, you don't have time for this. I said, this is exactly what I have time for. These letters are why I made this decision. These people are who I'm fighting for. One letter I'll never forget, from a 15-year-old girl in Burkina Faso, from a village 2 hours from Ouagadougou. Mr. President, I am in secondary school. My teacher told us about your speech. He said you found American spies and threw them out. He said you chose our dignity over their money. I asked him, will we be poor now? He said, maybe. But we'll be poor and proud instead of comfortable and ashamed. I understand now. Thank you for teaching me that some things matter more than comfort. I will remember this lesson forever. That letter sits on my desk. I read it every morning before meetings. Because when the pressure comes, when the threats arrive, when the consequences manifest, I remember that 15-year-old girl. I remember that she's watching, learning, deciding what kind of leader she wants to be someday. I can't fail her. I can't compromise for her. I can't surrender in front of her. Then came the consequences, real consequences, brutal consequences, exactly what they promised. 1 week after my speech, the World Bank announced a review of our development loans, $300 million in infrastructure funding, suddenly questionable. The IMF suspended our standby credit facility. $200 million we were using for currency stabilization, gone overnight. The European Union froze aid disbursements. 400 million euros for schools, hospitals, roads, water projects, all frozen pending review of our commitment to international partnerships. The United States reduced bilateral assistance by 70%, $60 million in annual aid, slashed. All within 10 days, all for technical reasons, all complete coincidence. My finance minister came to my office. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Mr. President, this is worse than we projected. We're facing a currency crisis, budget shortfalls, project cancellations. We need to do something. I said, what do you suggest? He said, apologize. Walk back the speech. Claim you were misinformed. Restore the relationship. Get the money flowing again. I said, no. He said, Mr. President, people will suffer. Real people. Poor people. They'll lose access to health care, to education, to clean water. Can you accept that responsibility? I said, can you accept the responsibility of teaching an entire generation that sovereignty has a price, and that price is too high to pay? Can you accept teaching our children that dignity is negotiable? Can you accept teaching our people that foreign approval matters more than national pride? He had no answer. Because there is no answer. Because some choices don't have good options. They only have right options. And easy options. I chose right over easy. But let me tell you what they didn't report, what they deliberately ignored, what they never wanted you to know. Within 2 weeks of the sanctions, my phone started ringing, not from Washington or Brussels or London, from Beijing, from Moscow, from Ankara, from New Delhi, from Dubai, from Tehran. China called first. The conversation was direct. Mr. President, we've been watching. We respect what you did. We understand sovereignty because we fight for ours every day. We'd like to discuss partnership. No conditions about your internal policies, no demands about your values, just business. Interested? I was cautious, because China has its own interests. Every power does. But at least they were honest about it. They wanted resources. They wanted trade. They wanted strategic positioning. But they didn't want to rewrite our constitution. They didn't want to lecture us about our values. They didn't want to monitor our communications. 2 weeks later, Chinese officials arrived. We negotiated infrastructure funding, $400 million, more than what Europe froze. For roads, bridges, power plants, fiber optic networks, no conditions except completion timelines and quality standards. Russia reached out. Same message. We don't interfere in internal affairs. We respect sovereignty. Let's discuss energy cooperation and technology transfer. Turkey called. We share values. We understand faith. We know what it means to preserve tradition while pursuing development. Let's build together. The Gulf states called. Saudi Arabia offered investment in agriculture. UAE proposed partnerships in renewable energy. Qatar discussed education initiatives. India called. Indonesia called. Malaysia called. Brazil called. South Africa called. Suddenly, we weren't isolated. We were connected to a completely different network. A network of nations tired of Western domination. A network of countries seeking alternatives to the old colonial relationships. A network of peoples who understand that development doesn't require surrendering identity. Within 6 months, we had negotiated partnerships worth more than what the West withdrew. More importantly, we had partnerships that respected our sovereignty. That didn't come with conditions about our values. That didn't require us to change who we are to receive support. But the most important change wasn't economic, it was psychological. I visited a village 3 months after the speech, a remote village that had lost a health clinic when European funding was frozen. I expected anger. I expected resentment. I expected people to blame me for their suffering. Instead, the village chief greeted me with celebration. They had organized a ceremony. They sang songs. They performed dances. They presented me with gifts. I was confused. I said, "Chief, you lost your health clinic because of my decision. Why are you celebrating?" He said something I'll never forget. "Mr. President, we lost a clinic built with foreign money that came with foreign control. But we gained something more valuable. We gained the knowledge that our president values us more than he values their approval. We gained the certainty that our leader will fight for us even when fighting costs him everything. We gained the pride of being citizens of a nation that stands tall instead of kneeling for aid." He continued. "The clinic will be rebuilt, maybe slower, maybe with less equipment, maybe with our own resources instead of theirs, but it will be our clinic, built by us, controlled by us, serving us without conditions, and that's worth the wait." That's when I understood. The people weren't angry about the economic consequences. They were proud of the moral choice. They weren't resentful about the sacrifices. They were grateful for the dignity, because they had been waiting their entire lives for a leader who valued them more than foreign approval, who chose their pride over diplomatic convenience, who fought for their sovereignty even when sovereignty came with suffering. I launched what I called the Burkina Faso Renaissance Initiative, not because I'm arrogant, but because Renaissance means rebirth, and that's what we needed, a rebirth of sovereignty, a rebirth of dignity, a rebirth of African independence. 5 pillars, each designed to reduce dependency and increase capability. First pillar, food sovereignty. We invested everything we had in agriculture. We provided seeds, tools, training to farmers. We built irrigation systems with our own engineers. We created cooperatives managed by our own people. We established government-guaranteed prices for key crops. No more dependence on foreign food aid. No more importing rice from Asia or wheat from America or corn from Europe. We grow it here or we don't eat it. Within 2 years, rice imports dropped by 75%. Wheat imports fell by 60%. Corn production doubled. We weren't just feeding ourselves. We were exporting to neighboring countries. We had become food secure without foreign assistance. Second pillar, digital sovereignty. This was personal, because the listening post taught me that you can't be politically sovereign if you're digitally dependent. If foreigners control your communications infrastructure, they control your sovereignty. We built our own encrypted communication systems. We trained our own cybersecurity experts. We established our own data centers. We created our own secure networks for government, military, and critical infrastructure. It wasn't easy. Western tech companies refused to work with us. American contractors withdrew. European consultants left. They said we couldn't do it without them. They were wrong. We hired experts from China, Russia, India. We trained our own young people. We built our own capabilities. Within 3 years, our digital infrastructure was more secure than it had ever been under Western systems. And we discovered something revolutionary. The technology isn't that complicated. The expertise isn't that rare. The capabilities aren't that exclusive. They just made us think we couldn't do it ourselves. They created dependency where none was necessary. Third pillar, manufacturing sovereignty. We stopped exporting raw materials and importing finished products. Cotton grown in Burkina Faso is now woven in Burkina Faso. Gold mined in Burkina Faso is now processed in Burkina Faso. Minerals extracted in Burkina Faso now create value in Burkina Faso. We built processing plants, we trained workers, we created supply chains, we developed markets, jobs were created, skills were developed, wealth stayed home instead of flowing to foreign corporations. Fourth pillar, educational sovereignty. We reformed the entire curriculum. We kept what was valuable from Western education, mathematics, science, critical thinking, technology. But we added what was missing: our history, our languages, our values, our perspective. We stopped teaching African history as a footnote to European history. We stopped teaching our languages as inferior to French. We stopped teaching our values as primitive compared to Western values. We created pride alongside knowledge, identity alongside education, African excellence alongside universal standards. Fifth pillar, cultural sovereignty. We invested in our artists, musicians, filmmakers, writers. We told our own stories. We created our own media. We stopped consuming only Western culture and started producing African culture that the world wanted to consume. Our musicians sang in our languages and the world listened. Our filmmakers told our stories and the world watched. Our writers documented our experiences and the world read, not because we copied them, but because we offered something different, something authentic, something real. The transformation took time. It wasn't smooth. There were failures, setbacks, challenges, moments when I questioned whether we could survive. But there was also something we hadn't felt in decades: hope. Real hope. Not the hope that comes from foreign promises, but the hope that comes from building something real with your own hands. People started returning home. The brain drain reversed. Young Burkinabe who had fled to Europe started coming back. Engineers who had worked in France, doctors who had practiced in Belgium, teachers who had taught in Canada, entrepreneurs who had built businesses in America. They said the same thing. We want to build something that matters. We want to be part of something meaningful. We want to contribute to something real. A software engineer who returned from Silicon Valley told me, "Mr. President, I was making $300,000 a year in California. I was comfortable. I was successful by every Western measure, but I was empty because I was building technology for American problems, serving American interests, making American companies richer. Your speech made me realize I could build technology for African problems, serve African interests, make African companies competitive. So I came home, I took a 90% pay cut, and I've never been happier. That's what sovereignty creates. That's what dignity produces. That's what happens when you give people something worth building. Within 4 years, our GDP grew by 18%, unemployment dropped by 12 percentage points, poverty decreased by 22%, literacy rates increased, health outcomes improved, infrastructure expanded, and we did it without compromising, without surrendering, without kneeling. But the most important change was invisible. It was in how people walked, how they spoke, how they looked at themselves and their country and their continent. They stopped apologizing for being African. They stopped seeking Western validation. They stopped measuring success by foreign standards. They started believing that African excellence was possible, that African solutions could work, that African leadership could succeed. A young woman told me something that summarized everything. She said, "Mr. President, few years ago my dream was to leave Burkina Faso, to escape Africa, to become European or American, to be anything except African. But your speech changed me, not immediately, gradually. Because you showed me that being African isn't something to escape. It's something to embrace. It's something to build. It's something to be proud of. Now my dream is to stay here, to build here, to raise my children here, to contribute to making Burkina Faso the nation it can be. You didn't give me a better country. You gave me permission to love the country I have." Those words broke something in me, not sadness, something deeper. Because I realized what we had actually accomplished. We hadn't just exposed a listening post. We hadn't just confronted foreign surveillance. We hadn't just demanded sovereignty. We had given an entire generation permission to be proud. Permission they didn't know they needed. Permission they had been denied their entire lives. Permission to look at Africa and see possibility instead of poverty, to see strength instead of weakness, to see home instead of something to escape. That's the real victory. Not the economic growth, though that came. Not the infrastructure development, though we built that too. But the psychological liberation, the mental decolonization, the spiritual emancipation, the permission to be African and excellent simultaneously, the freedom to build African solutions for African problems using African methods reflecting African values, the dignity of standing tall instead of kneeling for approval, the pride of being ourselves instead of apologizing for not being them. Because for too long we were taught that African meant inferior, that our languages were primitive, that our cultures were backwards, that our methods were outdated, that our values were wrong, that everything about us needed to change, needed to modernize, needed to become more like them. And we believed it. We internalized it. We accepted it. We taught it to our children. We built our education systems around it. We structured our economies to serve it. We organized our societies to reflect it. But that young woman's words showed me we were breaking free, not just politically, not just economically, but psychologically. We were reclaiming our identity. We were rediscovering our worth. We were remembering our value. And that's more powerful than any economic indicator. That's more valuable than any infrastructure project. That's more lasting than any diplomatic relationship. Because you can build a nation with borrowed money, but you can't build pride with foreign approval. You can develop infrastructure with external aid, but you can't develop identity with outside validation. You can create economic growth with international investment, but you can't create self-respect with someone else's permission. Real development starts from within. Real progress begins with believing you're worth progressing. Real prosperity requires thinking you deserve prosperity. And for the first time in generations, Africans were starting to believe again. To every African leader watching this, listen carefully. They will come for you next, not with armies like they did to our ancestors, not with colonial administrators like they did to our grandparents, but with something more subtle, something more sophisticated, something harder to resist. First, with money. They'll arrive with smiles and briefcases. They'll offer aid, loans, investment, development assistance, billions of dollars. And it will sound generous. It will sound like partnership. It will sound like they genuinely care about your development, your progress, your prosperity. But read the fine print. Study the conditions. Examine the requirements. Notice what they're really asking for. But read the fine print. Look for the conditions. Notice the requirements. See the strings attached. Because their aid always comes with control. Their money always comes with monitoring. Their partnership always comes with surveillance. Then with policies, they'll ask you to sign agreements, to adopt frameworks, to implement programs, to change laws, small changes at first, reasonable sounding adjustments. But each change moves you further from your values and closer to their control. Then with threats, when you hesitate, when you resist, when you question, they'll threaten consequences. Economic sanctions, aid withdrawal, diplomatic isolation, media campaigns. They'll make you choose between comfort and sovereignty, between prosperity and dignity, between their approval and your people's respect. And finally, if you still resist, they'll try to remove you. They'll fund opposition groups. They'll organize protests. They'll call it democracy promotion. They'll call it supporting civil society. They'll call it protecting human rights. But it's regime change. It's the same colonialism with better marketing. Do not bow. Stand tall. You were chosen by your people, not appointed by foreigners. You answer to your citizens, not to international organizations. You serve your nation, not the global agenda. When they threaten you, remember. Their threats prove you're on the right path. They only threaten leaders who threaten their system. They only attack presidents who refuse to be puppets. They only isolate nations that insist on being independent. If they're comfortable with you, you're probably compromised. If they're praising you, you're probably compliant. If they're giving you awards and international recognition, you're probably serving their interests instead of your people's. But if they're attacking you, if they're sanctioning you, if they're calling you dangerous, then you're probably doing something right. Then you're probably actually leading. Then you're probably actually serving your people. To the people of Africa, this is your moment, not my moment, yours. Because leaders come and go, governments rise and fall, presidencies end, but peoples endure. And your endurance depends on your choices today. Demand sovereignty from your governments. Demand to know who's operating in your country. Demand to know who's monitoring your communications. Demand to know who's extracting your resources. Demand to know who's influencing your policies. Because this isn't just about governments, this is about you, your privacy, your dignity, your future, your children's inheritance. You have the right to live without being monitored. You have the right to communicate without being surveilled. You have the right to exist without being watched. You have the right to be African without apologizing. Demand those rights. Defend those rights. Fight for those rights. And when your leaders compromise, when they surrender sovereignty for aid, when they trade dignity for comfort, hold them accountable, remove them, replace them. Install leaders who value you more than they value foreign approval. Because the future of Africa depends on this generation, on whether we choose sovereignty or submission, whether we choose dignity or dependency, whether we choose to stand or to kneel. To the international community, understand this clearly. We're not rejecting partnership, we're rejecting surveillance. We're not choosing isolation, we're choosing independence. We're not being anti-Western, we're being pro-sovereignty. You can work with us as equals, or you cannot work with us at all. You can respect our sovereignty, or you can leave our territory. You can partner transparently, or you cannot partner. Those are the terms: non-negotiable, final, universal. And to the intelligence agencies still operating across Africa, still establishing listening posts, still conducting surveillance, still violating sovereignty, hear this clearly. We're watching now. We're learning. We're sharing information. We're building capabilities. We're creating networks. Your operations aren't as secret as you think. Your facilities aren't as hidden as you believe. Your networks aren't as secure as you assume. We found one. Others are finding more. And when we find them, we expose them. We shut them down. We expel you. Because Africa is not your intelligence playground. Africa is not your surveillance laboratory. Africa is not your monitoring station. Africa is our home, and we're taking it back, room by room, facility by facility, sovereignty by sovereignty. This is not a moment. This is a movement. This is not one speech. This is a declaration. This is not one country. This is a continent awakening. We are done being monitored. We are done being controlled. We are done being violated. We are done being treated as territories instead of nations. We are sovereign peoples. We are independent nations. We are dignified humans. Let me tell you how this ends, not with predictions, with commitment. This ends with Africa controlling its own resources. This ends with Africa securing its own communications. This ends with Africa defining its own values. This ends with Africa building its own future. This ends with African children growing up proud of who they are. This ends with African leaders choosing their people over foreign approval. This ends with African nations standing tall instead of kneeling for aid. This ends with sovereignty. Real sovereignty, complete sovereignty, permanent sovereignty. They thought I wouldn't find their listening post. They were wrong. They thought I wouldn't expose it. They were wrong. They thought I wouldn't survive the consequences. They were wrong. They thought economic pressure would break me. They were wrong. They thought isolation would weaken me. They were wrong. They thought I was alone. They were wrong. Because I'm not fighting for comfort. I'm fighting for sovereignty. I'm not seeking approval. I'm defending dignity. I'm not worried about consequences. I'm focused on legacy. What will I tell my grandchildren when they ask what I did during Africa's moment of choice? What will I say when they ask whether I stood or kneeled? What will I answer when they ask whether I fought or surrendered? Because they will ask. Children always ask. And they deserve honest answers. I think about this question every single day, not in some abstract philosophical way, but in a very real, very personal way, because I have grandchildren, 3 of them. The oldest is 5. Her name is Amina, and she already asks questions that make me uncomfortable. Last month she asked me, "Grandfather, why do people say Africa is poor?" I didn't know how to answer. Because the truth is complicated. The truth is that Africa isn't poor. Africa has never been poor. Africa is the richest continent on earth in terms of resources, in terms of potential, in terms of everything that matters for development. But Africa has been made poor. Africa has been kept poor. Africa has been systematically exploited for centuries, and that exploitation continues today in forms that are harder to see, but just as devastating. How do you explain that to a 5-year-old? I tried. I said, "Amina, imagine you have a beautiful garden full of fruits and vegetables, but every day, someone comes and takes most of what you grow. They leave you just enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. Are you poor? Or are you being robbed?" She thought about it. Then she said, "I'm being robbed." I said, "Exactly. That's what's happening to Africa." She said, "Then why don't we stop them?" And I had no answer, because for decades we didn't stop them. We couldn't stop them, or we didn't know how to stop them, or we were too afraid to stop them, or we were paid not to stop them. But that conversation with Amina changed something in me, because I realized that my grandchildren will judge me, not by the speeches I gave, not by the policies I implemented, not by the economic indicators or the diplomatic achievements or any of the metrics we use to measure presidential success. They will judge me by one simple question. Did you fight for our dignity, or did you trade it for comfort? And when I found that CIA listening post, when I discovered that foreign intelligence had been monitoring our nation for 8 years, I knew this was my moment. This was the moment when I would be defined. This was the moment when my grandchildren would learn what kind of man their grandfather was. I could have hidden it. I could have negotiated quietly. I could have made a deal behind closed doors where the Americans would remove their operation and I would stay silent about its existence. Nobody would have known. The surveillance would have ended. The relationship would have been preserved. The aid would have continued flowing. That was the easy path. That was the comfortable path. That was the path that every advisor in my government recommended. But it was also the coward's path. Because hiding it would have meant teaching my grandchildren that some violations are acceptable if the price of confronting them is too high. It would have meant showing them that dignity is negotiable if the economic consequences of defending it are too severe. It would have meant demonstrating that sovereignty is conditional, dependent on whether powerful nations choose to respect it. I couldn't do that. I couldn't look Amina in the eye someday and tell her that I knew our nation was being violated, and I chose silence because speaking up was inconvenient. So I chose the hard path. I chose exposure. I chose confrontation. I chose to tell the truth, even though the truth would cost us everything. And it did cost us. It cost us hundreds of millions in aid. It cost us diplomatic relationships. It cost us international standing. It cost us economic stability. It cost us comfort and security and all the things that make governing easier. But it bought us something more valuable. It bought us dignity. It bought us self-respect. It bought us the knowledge that we are not for sale. It bought us the certainty that our sovereignty is not conditional on foreign approval. And that's what I will tell Amina. That's what I will tell all my grandchildren. I will tell them that their grandfather faced a choice between comfort and dignity, between prosperity and sovereignty, between foreign approval and national pride, between the easy path and the right path. And I chose dignity, I chose sovereignty, I chose pride, I chose right over easy. I will tell them about the night I couldn't sleep, the night after I decided to expose the listening post, the night when I lay awake wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my presidency, wondering if I was sacrificing my people's well-being for my own pride, wondering if I had the right to make a decision that would affect millions of people who didn't ask for this fight. I will tell them about the conversation I had with my wife that night, how she found me sitting in the dark at 3 a.m, staring at nothing, consumed by doubt. She didn't ask what was wrong, she already knew. She just sat next to me and held my hand. After a long silence, she said, "You're wondering if you're doing the right thing." I said, "What if I'm wrong? What if this destroys us? What if people suffer because of my decision?" She said, "People are already suffering. They've been suffering for decades. The difference is, now they'll be suffering while fighting for something real instead of suffering while accepting something false." I said, "But what if we can't survive without their aid? What if the economy collapses? What if everything falls apart?" She said, "Then it falls apart. But it falls apart while we're standing, not while we're kneeling. It falls apart while we're fighting, not while we're surrendering. It falls apart while we're free, not while we're controlled." She said, "And when our grandchildren ask what we did during Africa's moment of choice, we'll be able to look them in the eye and tell them we chose freedom, even when freedom was hard, even when freedom was costly, even when freedom seemed impossible." That conversation gave me the courage to move forward, because she was right. Some things matter more than comfort. Some things matter more than economic stability. Some things matter more than diplomatic relationships. Dignity matters more. Sovereignty matters more. Freedom matters more. I will tell my grandchildren about the morning of the raid, how I gave the order to secure the facility at dawn, how my hands were shaking when I made the call, not because I was afraid of the Americans, but because I was afraid of what would come next, afraid of the consequences, afraid of the unknown, but more afraid of living the rest of my life knowing I had the chance to stand and chose to kneel instead. I will tell them about watching the operation unfold on live video feed, watching our security forces surround the building, watching the Americans inside panic, watching them frantically destroy evidence, watching them realize they had been caught. And I will tell them about the feeling I had in that moment, not triumph, not satisfaction, but something deeper, something more profound. Relief. Relief that I had finally done something that mattered. Relief that I had finally stood for something real. Relief that when my time comes, when I face my Creator, I will be able to say I defended the dignity of my people even when defending them cost me everything. I will tell them about the phone call with the American ambassador, about how he threatened me, about how he warned me of consequences, about how he tried to make me feel small and powerless and dependent. And I will tell them how I responded, not with anger, not with hostility, but with calm certainty. I told him, "You can threaten me all you want. You can withdraw your aid. You can impose your sanctions. You can isolate us diplomatically. You can do everything in your power to punish us for demanding respect, but you cannot take away our dignity. You cannot take away our sovereignty. You cannot take away our freedom, because those things don't come from you. They come from us, and we will never surrender them again." I will tell my grandchildren about the speech I gave that evening, about how I stood in front of the nation and told them everything, about how I exposed the surveillance, about how I confronted the violation, about how I chose transparency over discretion. And I will tell them about the response, about how the people didn't react with fear. They reacted with pride. They didn't worry about the economic consequences. They celebrated the moral choice. They didn't ask what we would lose. They appreciated what we had gained. Because the people understood something that the experts didn't. The people understood that you can't build a nation on shame. You can't develop a society on submission. You can't create a future on foundations of foreign control. Real development requires dignity. Real progress requires sovereignty. Real prosperity requires freedom. I will tell them about the letters that came afterward. Thousands of them. From across Africa. From people who had been waiting their entire lives for a leader who would choose them over foreign approval. I will tell them about the farmer from Tanzania who wrote, "I am 63 years old. I grow maize. I never went to school. I don't understand politics. But I understand this. When someone enters your home without permission, they are not a guest. They are a thief. You threw out the thieves. Thank you." I will tell them about the university student from Kenya who wrote, "I study computer science. My professors teach us to build technology for Western companies, to solve Western problems, to serve Western interests. Your speech made me realize we can build technology for African problems, for African solutions, for African interests. You gave me permission to be African and excellent simultaneously." I will tell them about the grandmother from Senegal who wrote, "I am 80 years old. I survived colonization. I watched independence. I saw our leaders promise freedom and deliver dependence. I thought I would die before seeing true sovereignty. Your speech gave me hope that my grandchildren will live in a truly free Africa." I will tell them about the soldier from Mali who wrote, "I fight terrorists every day. The Americans give us equipment, they give us training, they give us intelligence, but they never give us respect. They treat us like children who need supervision. Your speech reminded me that we can secure our own countries, that we must, that our sovereignty depends on it." These letters showed me that I had made the right choice, not because the choice was easy. Because millions of Africans were waiting for someone to say what they felt, but never heard from leadership. Because people needed to know that dignity was still possible, that sovereignty was still achievable, that freedom was still worth fighting for. I will tell my grandchildren about the consequences, about the aid that was withdrawn, about the loans that were denied, about the sanctions that were imposed, about the isolation that followed. And I will tell them how we survived, not by surrendering, not by compromising, not by begging for mercy, but by building, by innovating, by cooperating with each other instead of depending on them. I will tell them about the partnerships we formed with other nations, nations that respected our sovereignty, nations that didn't demand we change our values to receive their support, nations that understood that real partnership requires mutual respect, not conditional submission. I will tell them about the investments we made in ourselves, in our agriculture, in our manufacturing, in our technology, in our education, in our culture. Investments that created real development instead of dependent development, growth that we controlled instead of growth that controlled us. I will tell them about the transformation that followed. Not immediate, not easy, not without setbacks and challenges and moments of doubt, but real, measurable, sustainable. I will tell them how our agricultural output increased, how our manufacturing sector grew, how our technology industry emerged, how our education system improved, how our culture flourished, how our people prospered, not because we had more foreign aid, but because we had more self-respect, not because we had better international relationships, but because we had stronger national identity, not because we were more connected to the West, but because we were more connected to ourselves. I will tell them about the young people who returned home, the brain drain that reversed, the engineers and doctors and teachers and entrepreneurs who had fled to Europe and America, seeking opportunity they couldn't find in Africa, how they came back. Not because Africa had become like Europe, but because Africa had become more authentically African. Because they realized they could build something meaningful at home. Because they understood they could contribute to something real. Because they recognized they could be part of something that mattered. I will tell them about the software engineer who left Silicon Valley, who was making $300,000 a year, who was comfortable and successful by every Western measure, but who felt empty because he was building technology for American problems while African problems remained unsolved. How he came home, how he took a 90% pay cut, how he started building applications for African farmers, for African traders, for African students, for African problems that Silicon Valley didn't care about and didn't understand. And how he told me, "Mr. President, I've never been happier, because now I'm building something that matters. Now I'm solving problems that affect my people. Now I'm contributing to something real instead of making American companies richer. That's what sovereignty creates. That's what dignity produces. That's what freedom enables. I will tell my grandchildren about the 15-year-old girl who wrote to me, the girl from a village 2 hours from Ouagadougou, the girl who asked her teacher, "Will we be poor now?" And how her teacher responded, "Maybe, but we'll be poor and proud instead of comfortable and ashamed." I will tell them how that letter sits on my desk, how I read it every morning before meetings, how it reminds me why I made this choice, how it strengthens me when the pressure comes, how it gives me courage when doubt creeps in. Because that 15-year-old girl is watching, learning, deciding what kind of leader she wants to be someday, forming her understanding of what leadership means, developing her concept of what matters most. And I cannot fail her, I cannot compromise in front of her, I cannot surrender while she's watching. I cannot teach her that dignity is negotiable or that sovereignty has a price or that freedom can be traded for comfort. I will tell my grandchildren about the village I visited 3 months after the speech, the remote village that had lost a health clinic when European funding was frozen, the village where I expected anger and resentment and blame, and how instead the village chief organized a celebration, how they sang songs and performed dances and presented me with gifts, how they thanked me for choosing their dignity over their comfort. I will tell them what the chief said, words I will never forget. "Mr. President, we lost a clinic built with foreign money that came with foreign control, but we gained something more valuable. We gained the knowledge that our president values us more than he values their approval. We gained the certainty that our leader will fight for us even when fighting costs him everything. We gained the pride of being citizens of a nation that stands tall instead of kneeling for aid." And how he continued, "The clinic will be rebuilt, maybe slower, maybe with less equipment, maybe with our own resources instead of theirs, but it will be our clinic, built by us, controlled by us, serving us without conditions, and that's worth the wait." That moment taught me something profound. The people weren't angry about the economic consequences. They were proud of the moral choice. They weren't resentful about the sacrifices. They were grateful for the dignity, because they had been waiting their entire lives for a leader who valued them more than foreign approval, who chose their pride over diplomatic convenience, who fought for their sovereignty even when sovereignty came with suffering. I will tell my grandchildren about the mother who stopped me on the street, who held my hand and cried, who said, "Thank you for teaching my children that some things matter more than money. Thank you for showing them that dignity has value. Thank you for demonstrating that freedom is worth fighting for." And how she said, "My son is 10 years old. Before your speech, his dream was to leave Burkina Faso, to escape Africa, to become European or American, to be anything except African. But after your speech, he told me, 'Mama, I want to stay here. I want to build here. I want to make Burkina Faso great.' You gave him permission to be proud of who he is. You gave him hope that Africa can be great. You gave him a reason to stay and build instead of leaving and forgetting. That's the real victory, not the economic growth, not the infrastructure development, not the international partnerships, but the psychological liberation. The permission to be African and proud simultaneously, the freedom to build African solutions for African problems, the dignity of standing tall instead of kneeling for approval. I will tell my grandchildren about the night I couldn't sleep, 6 months after the speech. The night when the full weight of the consequences hit me. When I calculated what we had lost. When I measured the economic cost. When I counted the diplomatic relationships that had been damaged. And how I wondered, in that dark moment, if I had made a mistake, if my pride had cost my people too much, if my commitment to sovereignty had sacrificed their prosperity, if my choice of dignity over comfort had been selfish rather than noble. I will tell them how I went to my wife again, how I found her awake, as if she knew I would need her, how I confessed my doubts and fears and regrets, and how she listened, without judgment, without criticism, without trying to fix my feelings or dismiss my concerns. And then how she said, "Let me ask you something. If you could go back, knowing everything you know now, knowing all the consequences, knowing all the costs, would you make the same choice?" I thought about it. Really thought about it. Considered all the suffering, all the sacrifice, all the challenges, all the costs. And I said, yes, I would make the same choice, because the alternative was teaching an entire generation that sovereignty has a price, and that price is too high to pay. The alternative was showing our children that dignity is negotiable. The alternative was demonstrating that freedom can be traded for comfort, and I couldn't do that. I couldn't live with that. I couldn't face my grandchildren knowing I had the chance to stand and chose to kneel instead. She smiled. Then you didn't make a mistake, you made a sacrifice, and sacrifice is what leadership requires. Sacrifice is what freedom costs. Sacrifice is what dignity demands. I will tell my grandchildren about the transformation I witnessed, not just in our economy or our infrastructure or our international relationships, but in our people, in how they walked, in how they spoke, in how they saw themselves, how they stopped apologizing for being African, how they stopped seeking Western validation, how they stopped measuring success by foreign standards, how they started believing that African excellence was possible, that African solutions could work, that African leadership could succeed. I will tell them about the young woman who told me, Mr. President, 5 years ago, my dream was to leave Burkina Faso, to escape Africa, to become European or American, to be anything except African. But your speech changed me, not immediately, gradually, because you showed me that being African isn't something to escape, it's something to embrace. It's something to build. It's something to be proud of. Now my dream is to stay here, to build here, to raise my children here, to contribute to making Burkina Faso the nation it can be. That's what sovereignty does. That's what dignity creates. That's what freedom enables. It gives people permission to be themselves, permission to be proud of who they are, permission to build futures that reflect their values instead of copying someone else's vision. I will tell my grandchildren about the African leaders who called me privately, some supportive, some terrified, some asking, "How did you survive? How did you withstand the pressure? How did you resist the threats?" And how I told them, I survived because I had something worth surviving for. I withstood the pressure because I was fighting for something real. I resisted the threats because I was defending something that mattered more than comfort. I will tell them about the leaders who followed, who found their own listening posts, who exposed their own violations, who made their own choices between comfort and dignity, who built their own networks of resistance, who created their own paths to sovereignty. And how, slowly, across Africa, the tide began to turn, how nation after nation started demanding respect, how government after government started choosing sovereignty, how people across the continent started believing that African independence was possible. Not the independence we claimed in the 1960 seconds, real independence, complete independence, economic independence, digital independence, cultural independence, psychological independence, the kind of independence where we control our own resources, where we secure our own communications, where we define our own values, where we build our own futures, where we stand as equals, not as subordinates, where we partner from strength, not from weakness. I will tell my grandchildren that this is what I fought for, this is what I sacrificed for, this is what I chose when I chose dignity over comfort. And I will tell them that the fight isn't over, that sovereignty is not something you achieve once and keep forever, that freedom requires constant defense, that dignity demands eternal vigilance. I will tell them that they will face their own choices, their own moments when they must decide between easy and right, their own opportunities to stand or kneel, their own chances to fight or surrender. And I will tell them that when those moments come, when they face those choices, they should remember their grandfather. They should remember that he chose dignity. They should remember that he chose sovereignty. They should remember that he chose freedom. Not because it was easy, not because it was comfortable, not because it was safe, but because it was right. And I will tell them that they should choose the same, that they should value dignity over comfort, that they should prioritize sovereignty over convenience, that they should defend freedom even when freedom is costly, because that's what it means to be truly free, not free from challenges, not free from sacrifice, not free from cost, but free to choose, free to stand, free to be who you are without apologizing, free to build what matters without asking permission, free to live with dignity instead of surviving with shame. I will tell them I found a CIA listening post on our soil. I will tell them I exposed it to the world. I will tell them I faced every consequence without compromise. I will tell them I chose their dignity over my comfort. I will tell them I valued their future over my present. And they will know their grandfather was free. Truly free. Completely free. Permanently free. Not because he had no constraints. Not because he faced no opposition. Not because he suffered no consequences. but because he made choices based on principle rather than pressure, because he valued dignity more than comfort, because he chose sovereignty over submission. That's what I will tell Amina when she's old enough to understand, when she asks me what I did during Africa's moment of choice, when she wants to know whether I stood or kneeled, when she needs to hear whether I fought or surrendered. I will tell her the truth, the whole truth. I will tell her that her grandfather had a choice that would define not just his presidency, but his character, a choice that would determine not just his legacy, but his integrity, a choice that would affect not just his generation, but hers. And I will tell her that when that choice came, when that moment arrived, when that decision had to be made, her grandfather chose freedom. Even when freedom was hard, even when freedom was costly, even when freedom seemed impossible. Because some things matter more than comfort, some things matter more than prosperity, some things matter more than approval. Dignity matters more, sovereignty matters more, freedom matters more. And I will look into her eyes and I will see that she understands, that she's proud, that she's grateful, that she knows her grandfather fought for her future even when fighting meant sacrificing his present. That's what I will tell my grandchildren. We are Burkina Faso. We are Africa. We are sovereign. And we will never surrender that sovereignty again. Not for aid, not for approval, not for comfort, not for anything. Because we learned something that generations before us forgot. We remembered something that colonization tried to erase. We understood something that exploitation tried to hide. That sovereignty is not given, it's taken. That dignity is not granted, it's claimed. That freedom is not bestowed, it's fought for. And once you've tasted real freedom, once you've experienced true sovereignty, once you've lived with genuine dignity, you can never go back. You can never unknow what you've learned. You can never unsee what you've seen. You can never unfeel what you've felt. We are free now. And we will stay free. Not because it's easy, but because it's right. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's necessary. Not because it's safe, but because it's who we are. We are Burkina Faso. We are Africa. We are sovereign. And we will never surrender that sovereignty again.